Robbie Basho was a visionary of the steel string acoustic guitar, a self-described musical mystic whose expansive compositions drew on Indian ragas, Japanese poetry, Native American prayers and more. Yet in his own time, he played mostly to small audiences, a cult guitarist in search of a cult following. He died obscure, in agonizing pain, and nearly alone. A truly shocking end for an orphan who had walked a lonely and yet spectacularly beautiful path all his life. But in the decades since, his legend has grown from footnote to phenomenon. Today, Robbie Basho is revered as one of American music's great lost originals, a 12-string guitar poet, spiritual seeker, and misunderstood trailblazer, whose life was as dramatic as his art. If you've never heard the name Robbie Basho before, prepare yourself for some of the most beautiful American music ever made, as well as one of its saddest tales. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Robbie Basho's life began under another name and in an uncertain world. He was born Daniel Robinson Jr. on August 31st, 1940 in Baltimore, Maryland, and fate immediately dealt him a tough hand. Orphaned in infancy, the baby boy was adopted by a local doctor named Daniel Robinson, who raised him as his son. In fact, Basho's birth mother's name, Eileen C. Webb, is only known from sealed records, but his original birth name remains a mystery, as does the identity of his father and the way they died. Nevertheless, he grew up in the comfortable Catholic Robinson household and attended strict parochial schools, singing in church choirs where he developed a powerful vibrato voice that would later become one of his trademarks. By his teens, he cut a pretty imposing figure, a barrel-chested jock, as one acquaintance remembered, and hard as it may be to believe now, he was more interested in sports than in arts at first. But inside the athletic young man stirred an unusually intense inner life. Friends later recalled him as eager, anxious, intense, and with a bit of an inferiority complex. A strong and athletic kid who was sweating with nerves, even as he discovered his talents. Basho's true musical awakening came in college. In 1958, he enrolled at the University of Maryland, College Park. And in those late 50s years, he underwent a rather extraordinary transformation from fraternity jock to cosmic beatnik and budding guitar innovator. He fell in with a small circle of obsessive folk and blues enthusiasts on campus. Among them were guitarist John Fahey and scholar Ed Denson, who together would soon found Tacoma Records, and another guitarist named Max Oakes, who was the cousin of folk singer Phil Oakes, another figure I made a video about a while back. I'll drop a link to it in the description so you can have a look at it after this one. These eccentric young men, going by the name of the East Coast Blues Mafia, bonded over hunting down rare old blues 78s and resurrecting forgotten folk songs. Daniel Robinson Jr., as he was still known, picked up a guitar for the first time during these college days. Though he hadn't played music before, he proved a natural on the steel string guitar. Fahey in particular took the passionate newcomer under his wing, introducing him to the art of American country blues, finger-picking on acoustic guitar. It was also at Maryland that Basho experienced his first great musical epiphany, one that opened his ears to a world far beyond Maryland or the Mississippi Delta. Sometime around 1962, he encountered a recording by Indian sitar master Ravi Shankar, probably an LP of raga performances. He later described himself listening to the Shankar album for hours in the dark, utterly transfixed. Then it dawned on me, Basho would recall, music is supposed to say something, music is supposed to do something. In that revelatory moment, the 21-year-old guitarist's artistic path was set. He became determined to infuse the spiritual depth of Indian classical music into the American folk guitar tradition. His friend Max Oakes watched Robinson's metamorphosis. The one-time college kid strumming blues covers was now reworking the Indian raga for guitar, experimenting with exotic open tunings and extended improvisations on his 6 and 12 string. By the time he left college, he would drop out in 1962 without graduating after being somewhat swept up in the cultural currents of the era. Basho had embraced a new identity to match his musical vision. In a move that shocked his fraternity-era friends, he legally changed his name to Robbie Basho, an homage to Matsuo Basho, the 17th century Japanese haiku poet he admired. The name change was anything but a simple youthful caprice. The idea was rooted in a profound spiritual experience. According to John Fahey, Robbie's rebirth occurred after a night on a mountaintop, under the influence of a great deal of peyote. The next morning, the story goes, Robinson declared that he was the reincarnation of the Japanese poet Basho, and thereafter insisted on being called Robbie Basho. Whether or not one takes that literally, John Fahey himself relayed the tale with a dose of skepticism. This moment captures the essence of Basho's emerging persona. Visionary, mystical, and utterly singular. He was aligning his very name and life with the artistic and spiritual traditions of Asia that had captured his imagination. Newly christened Robbie Basho, the young guitarist followed his compatriots in the early 1960s folk scene out to California, which was becoming a mecca for artistic and spiritual exploration. By the mid-60s, he had relocated to Berkeley, California, which was a hotbed of counterculture and music. There, Basho joined John Fahey and Ed Denson, who had started Tacoma Records in their mission to expand the horizons of the steel string guitar. He and Fahey frequently played the Bay Area coffeehouse circuit, and they honed their idiosyncratic guitar styles for small but devoted audiences. With the free speech movement erupting on the University of California campus and Eastern philosophy permeating the arts, Basho's esoteric musical vision found rather fertile soil. Basho's early California years saw his creativity flower in remarkable recordings that few knew what to make of at the time. In 1965, at age 24, he released his debut album, The Seal of the Blue Lotus, on Tacoma Records. From its title and cover art onward, this was no ordinary folk LP. Basho had developed an esoteric doctrine of color and mood for 12 and 6-string guitar, mapping musical chords to specific colors, emotions, and even mystical properties. In the liner notes, for example, he declared a D major chord to be green in a quiet pastoral mood, with the associative image of Irish meadowland. On Seal of the Blue Lotus, Basho's guitar instrumentals unfurled like ragas for the American frontier. Long meditative pieces with cascading finger-picked melodies that blended the pentatonic soul of Delta blues with the drones and scales of India. Listening to those early tracks today, you can hear a young artist straining for the transcendent. There's something in those syncopated 12-string guitar lines that flicker and surge. Raga, bluegrass, and blues all turning into some otherworldly swell. Basho wasn't imitating Indian music so much as attempting to capture its spiritual feeling on guitar. As he himself explained, you can't do a raga the way a Hindu would like it done, but you can get the feeling. Over the next few years, Basho quickly followed Seal of the Blue Lotus with a string of albums on Tacoma that grew his reputation, at least among those paying attention, as the strangest and most mystical of the new guitar poets. He released The Grail and the Lotus in 1966, and Basho Sings in 1967 on Tacoma, the latter being his first record to feature his singing voice alongside the guitar. That voice, a high quavering tenor with operatic intensity, would become one of Basho's most polarizing aspects. To some listeners, it was deeply moving, to others disconcerting or challenging to the ear. Unbothered by any detractors, Basho leaned fully into his unique vocals on tracks like Basho's Song of the Stallion or the traditional hymn Silent Night, both of which are on Basho Sings. Meanwhile, he continued to expand his guitar palette. The Falconer's Arm 1 and 2, two companion albums released in 1967, saw him perfecting what he called American ragas, which were lengthy solo guitar explorations dedicated to figures like the 17th century mystic St. John of the Cross. One might find him blending a Japanese folk melody with a flamenco-like attack on the strings, or evoking a Native American chant in his wordless vocals, sometimes all of those in the same piece. If the 1960s folk revival had been about earnest young troubadours playing Woody Guthrie songs, Basho's music seemed to arrive from another planet by comparison. As a Bay Area journalist later quipped, he stood out as an odd duck even in Berkeley's wild 1960s music scene. Basho cultivated an image not of a humble folk strummer, but of a shamanic visionary. He posed for his album covers in wild costumes, wearing embroidered tunics, cloaks, even knee-high moccasin boots, and brandishing his guitar as if it were a weapon on a holy crusade. Everyone else in the folk scene is trying to be a down-and-out folk singer, laying up against a brick wall with garbage around them, observed Tacoma's Ed Denson, and here's Robbie with his guitar held like a sword in these various costumes. The message was clear. Basho cast himself as a warrior poet of the guitar, on a quest for higher musical truth. His stance was that he was a mystical musician, exploring these other branches of music that nobody else was doing, Denson said. This grandiose presentation drew a few snickers from some of his contemporaries. Even John Fahey, his friend and mentor, sometimes regarded Basho's spiritual persona and flowery liner note poetry as a bit over the top. But Basho was totally unapologetic. As fellow guitarist Glenn Jones later said, whatever bag he was in it all the way. There was no holding back and no wobbliness at all. By the end of the 1960s, Robbie Basho had established a small but significant presence on the American music landscape. He was part of the first wave of the so-called American primitive guitar movement, alongside John Fahey and the young Leo Kottke, yet Basho was always the outlier of that trio. Fahey and Kottke, while innovative, stayed closer to American roots, blues, folk, country picking, and found receptive audiences in the growing folk circuit. Basho, by contrast, pushed into territory that was more exotic, impressionistic, and emotionally extravagant, which left many listeners and record executives perplexed. He did enjoy a few breaks. In 1966, Tacoma featured him alongside Max Oakes and Bucka White on an influential sampler LP, Contemporary Guitar, which exposed Basho's music to broader ears. And in 1969, Basho got his first release on a major label. He recorded the album Venus in Cancer for Blue Thumb Records, a subsidiary of a major Hollywood label. That album, cut in a Berkeley studio and filled with some of his most accessible and lyrical compositions, should have been a breakthrough. In fact, The Who's Pete Townsend, a huge admirer of Basho, later singled out Venus in Cancer as one of his personal favorites, calling it splendid. And this kicked off renewed interest in it decades later. But at the time, Venus in Cancer made little commercial impact. It didn't do much to expand his audience, as one retrospective assessment noted. It seemed that no matter how impressive Basho's music was, the world just wasn't quite ready to hear it. Basho was not distraught, and he was well aware that his music was unlikely to become even as popular as Fahey's given its highly esoteric and poetic nature. But still, there was some disappointment. He was also beginning to suffer from the extended use of psychedelic drugs in this period, and the nightmarish flashbacks that haunted him in moments of emotional weakness became horrifying. He was looking for a different path, one far from the chemicals of LSD and the natural intoxicants of peyote. If the 1960s had seen Robbie Basho establish his basic approach, the raga-inspired guitar epics, the integration of world influences into American folk, the 1970s saw him go even further, both musically and spiritually. This was the period where Basho's lifelong spiritual quest became fully entwined with his music. It was also a decade of both exciting creativity and growing isolation for the guitarist, as he chased visions that left many listeners behind. After years of psychedelic experimentation, he had, after all, literally found his name on a peyote trip. He became increasingly drawn to discipline and clarity through Eastern spirituality. In 1968 or 69, while studying North Indian classical music with a great sarod player, Ustad Ali Akbar Khan in Berkeley, Basho befriended a guitarist named Hank Mindlin. Mindlin was a devotee of Meher Baba, the Indian spiritual master famous for his silence and his creed against drug use. Pete Townsend was another follower. Through this connection, Basho encountered Sufism Reoriented, a Western offshoot of Meher Baba's teachings based in the Bay Area and led by a woman named Murshida Ivy Dusha. By the end of the 60s, Basho had effectively become a Sufi disciple under Murshida Dusha's guidance. He quit drugs entirely, mindful of Baba's strictures, and even refused to accept guitar students who were using intoxicants. He began regulating his life with ascetic rigor, precise habits of diet, exercise, and sleep, in an effort to purify himself as an instrument of the divine. Friends noticed positive changes. The terrifying LSD flashbacks that had haunted him since the late 60s finally abated, and Basho seemed calmer and more focused. He devoted himself completely, one account of his Sufi period states, and indeed the Sufi organization would later even execute Basho's will and manage his musical estate. Fittingly, as Basho's spiritual life shifted, so did the themes of his music. If his 1960s work had dwelt in the temples of Asia, his 1970s recordings increasingly turned to the wide-open landscapes and indigenous spirit of America, as if Basho was seeking to unite East and West within himself. The transition was marked by the 1972 album Voice of the Eagle. On that record, released by Vanguard, Basho shifted his focus from Asian mysticism to Native American mysticism. He dedicated songs to the Great Spirit and to native chiefs, and his 12-string guitar echoed the rhythms of tribal dances and plains winds. The title track, Voice of the Eagle, featured Basho singing in a soaring, keening voice that imitated, with sincere respect, the ululations of a Native American ceremonial chant. He was staking a claim that American folk music could encompass the sacred traditions of America's first peoples, not just the Anglo-European ballads, usually favored by folk revivalists. Basho, of course, was not Native American himself. His approach was that of a spiritual homage rather than cultural appropriation. This wasn't about copying or appropriation, but spirituality and respect, music journalist Jennifer Allen wrote, and she noted how Basho created conceptual roots for his songs drawn from myriad world traditions. In Basho's own words, he wanted to expand the American songbook with a sort of musical landscape painting, tapping into the intimate relationship with nature that indigenous cultures have. Basho's late 60s peyote vision of being a reincarnated samurai poet now evolved into something even grander. He wove a personal mythology in which he himself had lived many past lives. He came to believe, for instance, that he had once been a Mongolian horseman under Genghis Khan. Such convictions might make some chuckle at the eccentricity, but Basho expressed them with a disarming earnestness. The elaborate costumes he wore on his album covers, whether fringed buckskin jackets of Native American warriors or embroidered tunics fit for Persian bards, were in a sense his way of playfully honoring those past life identities, a sort of reincarnation cosplay. People who met him during this time often found him unusual, but always magnetic. Will Ackerman, the founder of Windham Hill Records, recalled visiting Basho's modest Berkeley apartment in the 70s. Books were piled floor to ceiling. He was an insatiable reader of philosophy and law, and at one point Basho paused their conversation to speak to an unseen presence in the corner of the room. The Black Madonna, he explained, a spirit who had joined their meeting. Robbie Basho was an angel. I don't believe he was terrestrial, Ackerman later said, reflecting on that encounter. I'd watch him play and be transported. I truly believe that his reality was more accurate than mine. He was seeing a spirit that I was not. Such was the aura that Robbie Basho projected, part gentle guru, part solitary madman, and wholly devoted to channeling the music he felt came through him from some higher realm. Musically, the 1970s brought both triumphs and frustrations for Basho. After Voice of the Eagle and its 1974 follow-up, Zarthus, which delved into Sufi themes and even included Basho singing in Persian on a track, he hit a stretch of comparative silence. By the mid-70s, he found himself without a record label and took a hiatus from recording. The burgeoning commercial popularity of acoustic guitar music was passing him by. In 1976, guitarist William Ackerman was inspired by Basho's earlier work to launch a new label, Windham Hill Records, which would popularize a mellower, more accessible brand of instrumental acoustic music, often filed under New Age. But initially, and rather oddly, even Windham Hill did not come calling for Basho. As Basho entered his mid-30s, the hard truth was that he remained a cult figure, respected by a small cadre of fellow musicians, but largely unknown to the wider public. He continued to perform live, mostly in small venues like college coffee houses, and those who saw him play in this era speak of concerts that were by turns mesmerizing and perplexing. A young Stanford student named Richard Osborne had heard Basho in 1968 and was so awed by the tremendous amount of gravitas, a tremendous amount of power in Basho's presence, that he later sought Basho out for lessons. Osborne studied with him for about a year. While he credits Basho for changing his life, here's a guy who figured out a way to put Indian classical music on the guitar, he said admiringly. Osborne also found his teacher's methods confounding. Basho, for all his hunger to be understood, had trouble explaining how he did what he did. He craved the discipline of discipleship, but couldn't put his own practices into a transferable system, Osborne observed later. It was, perhaps, the same quality that made Basho a difficult friend and a misfit in the music business. He was marching to the beat of a drum that only he could hear. That beat, however, never stopped resounding in Basho's own head. Around 1978, after several years out of the studio, Basho got a second chance in the recording world. Ironically, finally invited to the very label his influence had helped inspire. Will Ackerman's Windham Hill Records signed Basho and released 2 albums that would belatedly bring Basho's music to a slightly broader audience. The first was Visions of the Country, released in 1978. This record is a breathtaking cycle of pieces paying tribute to the American West. On this album, Basho seemed to channel all his wanderlust and patriotism into incandescent guitar melodies and heartfelt vocals about Montana mountains and Nevada deserts. One highlight is the song Orphan's Lament, in which Basho's voice, achingly vulnerable, addresses the existential loneliness of the forsaken, surely an allusion to his own origins as an orphan. He dedicated the song to all the little orphans of the rainbow, and may they find the gentle hand of the Creator, a line that speaks volumes about Basho's lifelong search for belonging and divine love. Another is the utterly haunting Blue Crystal Fire, a track which shows Basho at his most mysterious and magical all at once. I'll put a link to this one down in the description, and I swear, one listen to this, and you'll be as hooked on Basho as I am. The second Windham Hill album was Art of the Acoustic Steel String Guitar 6 and 12, an instrumental showcase that featured some of Basho's most virtuosic guitar work. On it, he included compositions like Pavan India, a raga-flavored reverie, named in homage to the land that had ignited his musical quest, and Cathedral et Fleurs, which demonstrated his synesthetic approach to music, assigning colors and moods to each guitar tuning. Basho actually published an esoteric chord system in the liner notes, detailing the colors and emotional properties he associated with various chords, further illustrating how he saw music in colors. These late 70s recordings finally gave Basho a taste of modest commercial success, or at least recognition within the flourishing New Age music scene. Windham Hill, known for its audiophile production and tasteful branding, put Basho alongside younger artists like Alex DeGrassi and George Winston, who were selling hundreds of thousands of albums. Basho's records did not sell in huge numbers, but they reached ears that had never heard him before. For once, he even got a bit of critical attention. Reviewers praised Visions of the Country for its panoramic beauty and noted Basho's ahead of his time fusion of genres. Still, Basho himself was not entirely at ease in the Windham Hill stable. Will Ackerman admired him, but even Ackerman conceded that Basho's eccentricities, musical and personal, made him a tough fit with Windham Hill's clean-cut image. Basho's challenging vocal style, that quavering Eastern-tinged tenor, could be an obstacle for listeners expecting only soothing instrumentals. One promoter in the early 80s joked that Windham Hill's ideal of contemplative, relaxing music didn't quite square with Basho's tendency to erupt into full-throated Native American war whoops in the middle of a set. Basho, for his part, tried to adapt. Observers note that in the 1980s, he trimmed his wild beard to a neat moustache, started wearing collared shirts instead of hippie robes, and generally tamed down his appearance, as if attempting to be more presentable to the mainstream. But when he picked up his guitar or opened his mouth to sing, he was still the same untamable spirit. By the mid-1980s, Robbie Basho's journey had taken a physical toll on him. Years of hauling around a 12-string guitar, not to mention the lingering effects of earlier injuries from his athletic years, had contributed to chronic back problems. In 1985, he suffered a serious accident while rock climbing, which left him with a damaged back and pinched nerves in his legs. He was hospitalized for a time in traction, immobilized for months. Characteristically, Basho willed himself back onto his feet and into performing shape through determination. A brief San Francisco Chronicle profile in late 1985 reported on his recovery, showing Basho's undimmed spirit and plans for the future, even as he acknowledged the setback had hurt him badly. It looked like he would be able to rely on his natural physical hardiness to get back on his feet, both literally and metaphorically, but fate had other much darker plans. In February 1986, Basho sought treatment for his persistent back pain at a chiropractic clinic in Berkeley. He was a believer in alternative healing methods. Over the years, he had tried everything from Chinese herbal medicine to acupuncture to macrobiotic diets, though amusingly, he would eat a huge steak before performances, believing the iron gave him strength. Chiropractic adjustments were another remedy he trusted. On February the 28th, 1986, during an appointment, Basho's chiropractor performed a neck manipulation maneuver, an intentional whiplash technique intended to realign his spine. In a freakishly rare complication, the hyperextension of Basho's neck caused his vertebral artery to rupture. The musician's brain quickly filled with blood, his vision blurred, and he collapsed, having a stroke on the spot. He was rushed to Walter Bates Hospital in Berkeley, confused and slurring words, and soon fell into a coma from which he would not emerge. When scans revealed the catastrophic arterial tear and hemorrhage, doctors gave no hope of recovery. After some agonizing hours, Basho's elderly adoptive father, Dr. Robinson, arrived from across the country, and the family made the heartbreaking decision to remove Robbie from life support. Robbie Basho died on February 28, 1986, at the age of 45. His sudden death was officially ruled an accident, with no malpractice found. Such fragile arteries are unusual in people so young, noted one chiropractic colleague, calling it a 1 in millions fluke. The chiropractor who treated him was said to be devastated and carried the emotional scars for years. For the tiny community of friends and fans who knew Basho, the news was crushing. But in the wider world, Basho's passing made barely a ripple. As one account noted, there was little mention of the death of the passionate singer-guitarist. A few short obituary notices listed the cause as a stroke and mentioned that he was survived by his father and a sister. It was an unfortunately quiet end for a musician who had so often yearned to be heard. The craggy individual who had once howled to the heavens on stage and claimed kinship with eagles and ancient poets simply slipped away, almost unnoticed. Basho's remains were cremated, and in a private ceremony, his ashes were scattered, fittingly in nature, returned to the elements he loved. He had always been something of a loner, a rare bird, inhabiting his own imaginative ecosystem. Those close to him understood that Basho's solitary path was perhaps inevitable. He lived in service of a muse that not many others could perceive. As composer Charles Amikanian, who interviewed him in 1974, put it, Robbie wanted to communicate his music and not a lot of people were listening. He was a bit of an idealist who didn't fit any convenient category. Amikanian remembered Basho in person as a nice person and a little bit sad. I wanted to help him and he was hard to help, noting how Basho could be prickly and utterly fixated on his own artistic vision. In the end, one senses that Basho made peace with his outsider status, but it truly broke his heart that he never found the wider audience he believed his music deserved. There was one aspect of earthly life that Basho longed for, but never fully attained, and that was romantic love. Despite occasional rumors that he had ladies' man adventures, one tale had him living with 2 beautiful Japanese girlfriends at one point. Others suspected he died a virgin. The truth is hard to pin down, but Basho clearly yearned for a soulmate. He wrote copious romantic poetry and openly told friends he wished he could find a woman to settle down with. In his Berkeley apartment, he kept a piece of paper taped above his bed with 3 hopeful words scrawled on it. "She is coming." Sadly, she never came. As Glenn Jones later observed, relationships with women didn't pan out for Basho. Reality didn't match his romanticized version. In songs like Wine Song, Basho would sing longingly of love gained and lost, perhaps projecting dreams he never got to fully live. It is a touching footnote to a life so devoted to the spirit. The one earthly communion Basho deeply desired, a loving partner, eluded him. In a sense, the gentle creator's hand that he invoked in Orphan's Lament remained the main comfort for his lonely heart. If Robbie Basho died in obscurity, he has been reborn in posterity. In the years after 1986, a devoted and growing cult of listeners and musicians worked to ensure Basho's music would not be forgotten, and their efforts have succeeded beyond what even Basho himself might have imagined. Today, Basho is hailed as a pioneer who was decades ahead of his time, and his recordings, once nearly impossible to find, are celebrated and studied. The slow-building Basho revival is a story of dedication, serendipity, and the rediscovery of a rare genius. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Basho indeed seemed to slip through the cracks. For about 15 years, most of his dozen-odd albums were out of print and only circulated via rare vinyl or cassette copies among aficionados. Yet a coterie of passionate fans quietly kept the flame. Some were individuals who had known him or been influenced by him. For instance, the German guitarist Stefan Basho Junghans, who upon hearing Basho's music in 1986 was so moved that he added Basho to his own name in tribute. The real turning point in Basho's resurrection came in the new millennium. In 2006, Tompkins Square Records reissued Venus in Cancer on CD and vinyl, the first high-profile Basho re-release in decades. Critically acclaimed and eagerly bought by guitar fans, this reissue introduced Basho's 1969 masterpiece to a new audience. Among those who picked it up was a young British filmmaker and music devotee named Liam Barker. Barker became fascinated, even obsessed, with the haunting figure of Robbie Basho. Barker spent the years doggedly researching Basho's life and tracking down anyone who had known him, trying to unravel the many layers of myth and truth. His quest culminated in a documentary film, Voice of the Eagle, The Enigma of Robbie Basho, which was released in 2015. The film, titled after Basho's 1972 album, became a linchpin of the Basho revival. It features interviews with Basho's contemporaries, including Pete Townsend, Will Ackerman, Glenn Jones, and others, and paints a loving, complex portrait of the artist. Watching the documentary, one can't help but feel Basho's spirit finally receiving the validation he hungered for. Here were people on camera, testifying to his impact, his struggles, his genius. And crucially, during the making of Voice of the Eagle, Liam Barker made a remarkable discovery. He unearthed Basho's long-lost personal archive of tapes and journals. After Basho's death, it turned out, many of his belongings, including his guitars and hundreds of hours of reel-to-reel recordings, had been left with the Sufism reoriented community. Barker managed to gain access to this treasure trove. It contained live concert tapes, home recordings, and even unreleased songs spanning Basho's entire career. The opening of the Basho archive led to a flood of posthumous releases that have thrilled fans and deepened the understanding of his art. Listening to these recordings is illuminating. You can hear Basho in small clubs and college halls around 1970, playing his heart out to half-empty rooms. On one tape, after an astonishing 7-minute instrumental blending raga and blues, Basho finishes to scant applause. Perhaps 2 hands clapping, maybe 4. As one reviewer noted, a pithy quote, which highlights the gulf between the music's brilliance and the audience's paltry size. In the end, Robbie Basho's life can be seen as a kind of American Odyssey in miniature, the story of an orphan in search of identity, who traverses cultural and spiritual geographies in his art, and who faces heartbreak and adversity while clinging to a personal vision. It has the makings of legend. The guitarist as wandering ascetic, as madman, a divine fool, one of those rare individuals who are touched by God. And like many legends, it was only after its abrupt end that its full significance came to light. Robbie Basho spent a lifetime reaching for heaven through 6 and 12 strings, and for a long time it seemed he fell to earth with barely a sound. But listen now to the reissued albums, the once lost tapes, the tributes, and you will hear Robbie Basho's spirit in full soar. In his 1974 radio interview, Basho mused about pushing music to higher realms. I don't call a lot of my stuff far out. It's far in as far as I'm concerned. That inward journey has finally radiated outward. The cult guitarist searching for a cult has at last found one. In the hush of an empty room or the applause of a distant era, a couple of hands might just be clapping for Robbie Basho, and hope that somewhere he can finally hear us. Well, I hope you enjoyed that one. After a couple of well-known figures in recent videos, I couldn't resist getting into one of my personal, all-time favourite artists, at least of recent years. If he's a new name to you, he's well worth exploring. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with another musical tale. My name's Chester, and for those who keep asking, I'm from London, and that's where my accent is from. Not everyone in England speaks like Harry Potter, would you believe? Anyway, cheers and have a good one. See you next time.